Hi, it's Maija here with my wrap-up for the reading quest. This was a reading challenge that ran from mid-August to mid-September, so this is at the same time my whole August and half of my September wrap-up. So before the reading quest, I only finished one book, so I will talk about that one first. I'm still continuing to slowly read the Hercule Poirot books in order, and this is 3-Act Tragedy by Agatha Christie. This is the 12th Poirot book. It actually says in the official list at the back of the Poirot books that this is the 11th one, but Poirot's early cases is listed at the end of that list, but those short stories were actually set and written quite near the beginning of the series. So for me this is the 12th because I already read Poirot's early cases. So the plot of this book revolves around 2 dinner parties, and in the middle of both of those someone dies, and of course most of the guest list is the same. So the second murder casts suspicion on the first death as well, because at the time that first death was deemed to be from natural causes. For me there was too little Poirot in this Poirot book. He's there at the first dinner party right at the beginning, and then he returns for the final third. Also, I had just happened to see this episode of the TV series right before reading this book, so I knew who the murderer was, I knew all the twists and turns, so nothing was really a surprise for me since that episode was a pretty faithful adaptation of the story. My favorite thing was Poirot's final one-liner at the very end of the book. I laughed out loud at that one. That was a classic Poirot moment. But all in all, this is not a standout in the Poirot mysteries, and I gave it 3 stars. So the next week of August was Worldcon week here in Finland, so I didn't read anything. I was out from the morning until the night and just came home to sleep, and no reading was done. The reading quest started on Sunday, which was the last day of Worldcon, and I started reading on the Monday with The Raven Stratagem by Yoon Ha Lee. This is the second book in the Machineries of Empire series, the continuation of Nine Fox Gambit. Nine Fox Gambit was a science fiction book that focused on Captain Kel Sheris, who had this undead tactician called Shuo Zhejiao implanted into her brain. So she has 2 consciousness in one body, and they were sent to stop this rebel uprising. And Raven Stratagem continues the story. In the second book, I like that the secondary characters were a lot more well developed than in the first book. In the first book, I felt that all the side characters were superfluous, and I felt that the book should have just focused on Sheris and Zhejiao and left all of the other people out. In this one, the focus is on the other characters and how they react to Sheris or Zhejiao, and I really enjoyed that perspective. I also like that we followed characters in different places. Opposite to the first book, where the final 100 pages were my least favorite because of this POV skipping to what I felt were superfluous characters, in this one I actually enjoyed the final 100 pages the most. Before that though, this book felt a bit drawn out in places, which is why I didn't feel like I could give it as strong a rating as the first one. I gave the first one 4 stars and this one 3.5. So it took me the first whole week of the reading quest to finish Raven Stratagem, just one quest for the challenge, and it actually fulfilled the challenge of Animal Companion, read a book with an animal in the title, of course ravens. So my character was a mage, and now she had a raven companion. So since it took me so long to read the Raven Stratagem, I decided to pick up something shorter for the mage's main quest. I had planned to read Silver on the Tree by Susan Cooper for the challenge, a book based on mythology, but instead I went with the 5th volume of The Wicked and the Divine, Imperial Phase Part 1, this by Kieran Gillen and Jamie McKelvey. So this comic series focuses on a group of gods who are reincarnated into the bodies of young people in the modern day and age. And this just honestly keeps getting better and better. Volume 5 was so entertaining. There's this new god that was introduced in Volume 4, I think it was, properly. And she definitely ups the entertainment value. She is so unpredictable. I love her. Actually, in this, everyone is unpredictable and flawed, and I really enjoy that. And I gave this one 4.5 stars. The art also continues to be amazing. Then on my library's overdrive, my hold on Down Among the Sticks and Bones by Shannon Maguire came in. This is the second novella in the Wayward Children series. I used this for the challenge, a book set in a different world, since this is a portal fantasy book. Even though there are like snippets at the beginning and the end which are set in our world, I still use this 4-book set in a different world. My original plan was to read Melusine by Sarah Monet, but I went with this one because it was a library book. So this fantasy novella tells the story of Jack and Jill, 2 characters from the Every Heart a Doorway novella, and what happened to them in their portal fantasy world. And I was so taken by the aesthetics of this story. Just look at this cover. It is a fantasy world that reminded me of Hammer horror movies. Like it has vampires, scientists using lightning, Moors, windmills. The setting was very atmospheric. Also, it had beautiful illustrations by Rowena Kai, who is one of my favorite illustrators. I was so happy about those illustrations, even though there were, I think, only about 3 of these, but I think they really help set the mood also, and they fit the writing so well. I would love to have these novellas of every single character from Every Heart a Doorway. If at all possible, thank you. I gave this one 4 stars. So then I went to visit family, and then I got the flu from my cousin's kids. So that like wiped out a week out of my reading quest reading like that. So that meant that when I could focus on reading again, I switched my whole TBR to short books. So everything that you saw in my TBR video that I planned to read for the Mage quest, I didn't read. So now we are moving on to September after the week that I had the flu, and the first book that I could focus on, because it was a kid's book, was Magicians of Caprona by Diana Wynne Jones. This is set in the World of Crestomancy series, and I read this for the challenge, a book that contains magic. Originally I had planned to use The Stone Sky by N.K. Jemisin for that, but I switched it up for this. This is set in a fantasy world reminiscent of historical Italy, and it focuses on these 2 magical families who hate each other. Tonino, the main character, is from the Montana family, and he isn't that good with spells. So there's this mysterious enchanter on the loose attacking the city-state of Caprona, and it sort of deals with, can these 2 magical families stop fighting and blaming each other and deal with this enchanter instead, or are they just gonna let the enchanter do whatever? Tonino is one of the only ones who believes in the existence of the enchanter. Everyone else just keeps blaming each other. So this was quite an enjoyable romp, but quite separate from all the other Crestomancy stories. Crestomancy himself does feature in this, but the focus is on Tonino and his quest to stop the enchanter. I found myself getting more and more into the story as I went on, and it was a fun enough story. I gave it 3 stars. On the same day, I also finished Mixed Magics by Diana Wynne Jones, or the last short story from this one, called Stealer of Souls. I hadn't been able to read that one for the booktubeathon since it featured Tonino from Magicians of Caprona, and I wanted to read that one first, so now I could finally finish this. I used this for the side quest challenge expansion, which was about reading a companion novel or short story. So Stealer of Souls was about Tonino from Magicians of Caprona and Cat from Charmed Life being kidnapped by this evil enchanter. And the short story could have been a bit more exciting. I actually found it quite uninteresting, quite boring. I think many young readers would find it more tense than I did. But talking about the whole book, so it had 4 short stories in the Crestomancy universe, and they weren't as good as Diana Wynne Jones's novels. The Sage of Thiare was my favorite one, perhaps because when Crestomancy shows up in that one, he has the flu, and I would give that one 3 stars. My least favorite was the Stardust story Warlock at the Wheel, which I just didn't mesh with at all. And by the way, if a dog ate a whole chocolate cake, wouldn't the dog be poisoned? Anyway, I gave this one only 2 stars. So then it was getting quite close to the end of the reading quest. It was the final week and the latter half of the final week, and I still had 2 more mage challenges left. So I just tried to find short enough books to fulfill those 2 challenges. So I picked up Hammers on Bone by Cassandra Khaw from my library's Overdrive system because it is a novella, and I used it for the challenge, the first book in a series, since it is part of a novella series called Persons Non Grata, I think. I had planned to read The Just City by Jo Walton for this, but I couldn't do it in the time left, so I went with this one instead. So this is a horror novella about John Persons, who is a PI and also an ancient arcane monster, and he gets hired by this little boy to investigate his stepfather, who is also a monster. I liked how the novella mixed noir detectives with the Cthulhu mythos. And my favorite thing was that the main character spoke in this noir detective sort of way, because the monster really liked those movies. But in the end, the story itself wasn't really my cup of tea, although the writing style was quite good. So I couldn't give this one 2 stars, which I usually would give to a story that didn't appeal to me specifically, because the writing quality was so good, so I ended up giving this one 3 stars. And on the final day of the reading quest, I finished Sunbolt by Intisar Kanani, the first book in the Sunbolt Chronicles. For the challenge, read a book with a one-word title. Originally, I had planned to read Steelheart by Brandon Sanderson, but that wasn't happening. So I had picked this up quite a while ago because it had been free for the Kindle at the time, and now I was just searching my books for something with a one-word title that was short, and this came up and I decided to read it, and I'm happy that I did. So this is an indie young adult fantasy novel about Hitomi, who is this orphan thief on the streets of this nation that is not her home nation after she moved there with her parents, but then her parents disappeared or died, and now she is all by herself. She has secret magical abilities, and she's also part of this rebel faction called the Shadow League, which is a movement against this powerful archmage that is sort of ruling this whole place. But then one of the Shadow League's missions goes really wrong. So I really enjoyed this, which was a lovely little surprise. I'm glad I picked it up for this challenge, because otherwise I think I would have just been putting it off. I'm glad I read it now. At first I was hesitant because I felt that some of the elements were introduced a bit clunkily, but as the story went on I found myself enjoying it more and more. And in the second part, vampires are introduced. This book has both vampires and mages in high fantasy. I was so excited. My favorite part in this was that the main character has a really great moral compass. It's quite refreshing in a fantasy story among all this grimdark to have a character with a strong sense of justice who's willing to do what's right at the expense of herself. There are 2 main parts of this book happening in different settings, and I have to say that they are quite separate from each other, but that didn't really bother me that much because I really liked the second part and the second setting more than the first one, so that worked for me. I want to know what happens next, so I will continue on with the series, and I gave this one 3 stars, but I have to say a content warning for this book because it did have an attempted sexual assault, which I don't think fit well with the kind of story that this was in other ways. It could have easily been left out. So I finished the mage quest on the final day of the reading quest, with my mage being on level 4 with 126 health points, and I'm quite happy that I managed to finish the quest, even though I had 2 off weeks, what with the Worldcon tiredness and the flu, and I still did it. And now I think this video is quite long enough, so I will wrap up the final 4 books that I read in September in a separate wrap-up video. I'll see you later.